So I thought a cool talking point for today's discussion video would be type fluidity, type development, the idea of even overcoming our type entirely. And indeed, it's almost been a year since I launched this channel. And when I did launch it, I also put out a channel trailer, which many of you would have seen, talking about the central motivations behind CPT. One of them being, if not the most important one being, the idea of using type to empower us rather than limit us. Using cognitive type as a kind of cognitive map to present different pathways, different doorways towards achieving any goal pretty much that you'd want to achieve. And, in presenting and discussing the degree to which this is possible, we need to sort of explore what type is in the first place. And I have to admit, insofar as the nature over nurture argument goes, I do lean more towards the side of nature, insofar as are we born into our type? Or does type accrue with, accumulated experience? And in exploring this particular topic, it's not as simple as that might seem. Yes, I believe we're born into our type. I believe actually type is highly biological. Our very genome is individualized to us, as is the very structure of our brain. I literally believe everybody's brain is different. And there's a lot of evidence indeed supporting the idea of genetic memory. I do believe the brain has a personality, and I believe cognitive type is much closer to this innate personality of the mind than it is to more fluid personality concepts such as values and identity. But there's a huge nature component here as well, because yes, we are likely born with a innate cognitive predisposition, but it is only through accumulated repetitive use of the brain in a certain manner, repeated subservience, if you will, to that predisposition, that a cognitive habit is essentially programmed over time. So I actually really do believe cognitive type is a combination of nature and nurture. And it is the nurturistic component that I really talk about when I'm talking about overcoming our type. Because I'm not entirely sure if predisposition, or at the very least a kind of default or even resting cognitive state, can be changed. And it really is the nurture component that I refer to when I talk about overcoming type. But it is also a running experiment. Because the more we can all collectively run this experiment upon our own cognition, see how far we can push it, see how far we can overcome our type, that will allow us to establish the ratio between the nature and nurture elements in dictating our cognitive flow. And my cautious hypothesis in relation to this is that we have a kind of predisposition, a default state, if you will. But that state is only strong as a compulsion relative to how much of a habit we have programmed through repeated subservience to that compulsion. Because the fact is, the brain is incredibly adaptive. If, for example, INFP trains their connection to the concrete world, really locks in, really tries to kind of deprogram what would otherwise be a kind of innate dissociative tendency, then I believe the brain would adapt. The pathway towards extroverted sensing for this type would become stronger. But what I'm wondering here is, if this pathway becomes stronger, does that beget a compulsion towards that particular function? Or does the function just become more easily accessible? Because if it is the former, if an INFP, for example, training extroverted sensing, with any respective codec that would be attached to, be it extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling, would that change their default cognitive state? And again, within my own cautious hypothesis, I would say probably not. I'd say the default state would perhaps become a bit less of a constant compulsion but it would still be a state the INFP naturally returns to. And maybe there's an important distinction to make here. Maybe the compulsive element of our predisposition is something that can be overcome, and in that sense maybe we can completely overcome our type. And maybe our true cognitive type, that which we are really born with, is not so much a predisposition as it is just a default state. And it is only an increasing reliance upon that default state, using one function essentially to make up for another, that actually forms what we currently understand to be cognitive type. And as passionate as I am about using type as a means of empowerment, not just for myself, but for everybody else, I have to admit, a lot of my agenda is also dictated by a natural curiosity. I'm interested. I want to see how far we can push it. I'm interested in the human psyche. And heck, I'm interested in myself. I like to run experiments. I like to make alterations to my own lifestyle, change my diet up, change my exercise regime, fast for this amount of time, meditate for that amount of time, don't meditate anymore, do this instead, add different supplements in. I'm just a naturally curious individual. And in regards to cognitive functions, they are no exception. I like to experiment with different cognitive function employment. I like to see how far I can push it. And just assess in a more detached manner how long it takes me, for example, to just reset to a kind of factory default. And this is especially true in regards to, as you might expect, extroverted thinking and extroverted sensing. And I've got to say, thanks in particular to all of your feedback, be it of a more positive or constructively critical nature, extroverted thinking has become, over time, particularly in this last 12-month period, a much bigger part of my everyday life, even a part of, you could say, my default state. And since my extroverted thinking seems to rather consistently originate from a more introverted thinking preconceptualization, I would argue the pathway between those two orientations of the thinking function has become stronger. But I would also argue the pathway between extroverted sensing and extroverted thinking, perhaps not so much, because I haven't really been using it in the same way as I have been using my extroverted intuition, extroverted thinking. A lot of my extroverted thinking employment has been a lot more macroscopic than it has microscopic. And so my extroverted thinking experiment, at least in a more ENFP-like fashion, has been very successful, but I would also argue my extroverted sensing hasn't developed much in the last year. I haven't been doing a lot more concrete activity. And paradoxically, the quarantine that was imposed earlier this year, and is still in effect in many ways here in the UK, has developed my extroverted sensing in a way I didn't expect. You see, before quarantine, I had set activities I was doing. I was kind of relying on those activities, those excursions, if you will, to make up for what would otherwise be a lack of conscious engagement with the concrete world around me. But quarantine actually gave me a newfound appreciation for the concrete. As things are denied, then those things are consciously appreciated in that state of deprivation. And so since March I've actually been paying a lot more attention to the concrete world. It's felt a lot less antagonistic. But you could also argue, since the exposure to the concrete world has become less necessary, less reluctant even, then the association with it becomes more positive, because any interaction with the concrete world is within my own control. And that would actually encourage a higher degree of egoistic relation to the function. And again, using my country as an example, things have actually become a lot more controlled. There's a protocol to follow no matter where you go. Supermarkets, shops, pubs across the UK, there's always a kind of an order where there was comparatively less order before. And so, perhaps for NI dominants like myself, this would make the associations with extroverted sensing less chaotic, less scary, less uncertain. Because owing to the protocol people are following in regards to the concrete interaction element, things are predictable. You can go into it with a set vision of how things will unfold, with very little deviation along the way. So again, as part of my own self-experiment, I do wonder, once quarantine rules have been lifted even further, if I will retain my egoistic relation to my oppositional function, or if I will once again develop this kind of love-hate relationship with it, whereby I sort of have this checklist of external things I should be doing, which I do oftentimes reluctantly in order to just look after my own mental well-being. Because for as long as you have such a robotic approach to extroverted sensing, you will never fully embrace it, you will never fully integrate it within, your ego complex. And thus my dominant functions and my opposing functions will remain irreconcilable. And extroverted sensing, extroverted thinking, in the oppositional position, will remain reluctant for as long as I am perceiving such external concrete interaction as antagonistic to, rather than complementary to, the agenda of my dominant functions. So you could say that our convergent employment of our opposing functions, that dominant oppositional axial rotation, is only reluctant for as long as we perceive those functions and their convergent employment as counteractive to our primary dominant agenda. Because I have to admit, to serve my primary agenda, that curiosity, that desire to encapsulate all reality under a single universal theory of everything, I do a lot more extroverted sensing observation, that is the divergent employment of that function, than I do extroverted sensing interaction. But you could also say, though, the observation element is only one part of the scientific process. Because, upon observation I can form hypothesis and anecdote. But to actually run an experiment, particularly if it pertains to running it upon myself, I require concrete activity. Particularly in this instance of the more extroverted sensing, extroverted thinking persuasion. So it is not so much that the convergent employment of our oppositional function is actually antagonistic to our dominant agenda, but it's fair to say we often experience it as such because there is actually a two-step process involved. I will be observing, I will be forming hypothesis within my introverted, intuitive, introverted thinking landscape, and the experimentation and execution will subsequently follow. But a lot of my experimentation is admittedly done in a much more extroverted, intuitive fashion. I make alterations to my lifestyle, I change macroscopic superstructure much more than I do the microscopic. I tend not to play around with the micro past the point of necessity. For example, I've got my camera settings here on a state I'm happy with, and then I've left it in that state rather than experiment further. I don't play around with the color settings past the point of necessity. I don't play around with the audio EQ more than I have to, even though if I did all of these things, the channel would probably benefit further. And this isn't because I've decided I don't need to. This isn't just because I'm being frugal with my energy expenditure, the focal point of my cognition. No, it's just because I don't have a natural compulsion to do these things. So I've been using a lot more extroverted thinking, but even though I have been using my extroverted sensing in a more convergent manner, even though I am relating much more to the concrete external world more than I ever have, the compulsion itself to use that function, at least a compulsion of a more deep and even limbic nature, hasn't actually changed. I'm using extroverted sensing just because I think it would be a good idea. But of course, this is still early days, and I will keep you all informed of my progress. Because of course, changing my perception of the function is a great first step. But I'm interested to see whether or not strengthening the pathway between extroverted intuition and extroverted sensing, for example, would give rise to a greater compulsion, would integrate a greater amount of extroverted sensing, being as it is just a continuum, into my, shall we say, default cognitive state. But I also want to hear the results of your experiments. Let me know how much your relationship with your oppositional function has changed over the last year or so. And heck, why not embark on our own collective experiment? Let's all experiment with our oppositional function, for example. Let's all try and engage our oppositional function with the opposing orientation of our convergent auxiliary. So, INFJs, extroverted sensing, extroverted thinking. INTJs, extroverted sensing, extroverted feeling. ENTPs, introverted sensing, introverted feeling. Let's say we all take 2 weeks and allocate an hour of every single day to engaging that particular codec lens pairing. And let me know your own protocol Maybe ENTPs will revisit meaningful memories. Maybe INTPs will reach out and foster new, intense, extroverted feeling connections. And I've got to admit, you guys have it rough here, because a convergent employment of extroverted feeling alongside extroverted sensing does take a lot of vulnerability, much more than extroverted sensing and extroverted thinking, as in my case. But I'd absolutely love to know your own results. In 2 weeks' time, send me a message or just leave a comment in the comment section below this video. Let me know how it's gone. Because a week after that, I'll be releasing a video with my own results and reflecting upon the results of other people. And maybe this will work, maybe it won't. It depends upon your own willingness to engage in this particular study, shall we say. But I think this will be a fun way for us to experiment a bit with the concept of type development, see what we can achieve in 2 weeks' time. And if you want any help or assistance in running this particular self-experiment, I do offer consultations as well. Because I'm very aware with this video I'm raising a lot more questions than I'm answering, because the type development experiment is still at its very onset. I have many hypotheses around the subject. I do believe type is more nature over nurture. I do speculate that the compulsion element of cognitive type is much more habitual, with the more innate and even static and unchanging element of type pertaining much more to a kind of default resting state. And this begs the question, how much are we just innately hardwired to have that kind of cognitive compulsion, that cognitive magnetism towards our default state? But what I do know is whether or not we can truly change our cognitive compulsion, our predisposition towards certain cognitive function employments over other ones, we can increase and strengthen the pathways between all of these functions. We can use our volition in order to access different parts of our cognitive map. But the extent to which this will be natural, the extent to which we will always rely upon willpower in order to access different parts of this map, remains to be seen. And as many of you know, I really do believe the best type is no type. Not in the sense of we shouldn't have any kind of default cognition, but rather in the sense of, in order to really inform and enhance our own dominant agenda, whether or not it's dictated by our cognitive functions, we must use all of our cognitive functions in order to bolster it. An individuated cognitive stack serves the dominant agenda better than one which is utterly divided. And the fact is, different parts of our lives require different employments of cognitive functions. If we're able to engage those functions in a fluid manner, particularly if we don't have to exert an undue amount of will in the process, our life would become easier. We would become better at overcoming the hurdles that life presents us. And naturally, the more hurdles we can overcome, the more hurdles we allow ourselves to be presented in the first place, the stronger we become. And the stronger we become, the more we can enrich our lives and the lives of other people. But yes, another great big call to action. Let us run an experiment together. Let us experiment upon our oppositional function. Just take 30 to 60 minutes out of your day to play upon the function. See how much you can integrate it with your natural way of being, your modus operandi. I'd absolutely love to know how it goes. And in 3 weeks' time from now, I'll be releasing a video discussing the findings of our collective study. And if you want, even send me a short video discussing your findings. If I get a few video submissions, I'll include them in the video as well. Just tell me things like, how has it affected your happiness? How has it affected your productivity? How difficult has it been? How natural does the function feel to you now that you've undergone the 2-week experimentation process? So yeah, maybe this will be a success, maybe it won't be, but either way I'll be sure to let you know how my own self-experiment goes. And that brings us to the end of this discussion video, so I'd absolutely love to know your own particular thoughts on this issue as well. To what extent do you believe type is fluid? To what extent do you believe type can be overcome? To what extent do you believe strengthening the pathways between different cognitive functions can also give rise to a greater compulsion towards that function's employment? Will our ego complex always reside within our dominant stack? How much does the convergent employment of our opposing functions feel like a kind of altar? So as usual, I'd absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this topic down below in the comments. And just a few call to actions before I leave you, and if you're still with me so far, thank you, you were awesome. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to let me know by hitting that like button, and if you haven't already done so, I highly recommend subscribing to the channel as well. And if you click that subscribe button, I highly recommend clicking the bell icon next to it too, because that way you can stay notified of future content. If you are interested in more of the fundamentals of the theory, I highly recommend checking out a CPT ebook. And if you are uncertain about your type or just like to know about how your type more specifically applies to you as an individual, I highly recommend checking out the CPT type service. And CPT is also on Patreon, so if you are interested in supporting the channel and the theory on that additional level, that would be massively, massively appreciated. But of course, it goes without saying, I already massively appreciate your support and feedback over this medium as well. So that's it from me, and I'll be back in a few days' time. For now, take care of yourself.